Hello everyone, welcome to my room. Say hello to Cookie, who is not a fan of being held, as you can see. She's not delighted, but she is a very adorable lady. Okay, Cookie, back to my bed. Yes. Oh, she is not delighted with what I just did to her. Just give me a second. Yes, baby, yes. Okay, so today we're going to discuss the decline, the slow, inevitable decline of the INFJ. So you might be thinking, has Ren dealt us a bit of a clickbait here? What is he going to try to do? Oh, by the way, my cold is getting better and my eye is a lot less sore than it was yesterday. So I am on the mend, in case you're wondering. Thank you for your kind words on my video yesterday, by the way. So behind this idea of a decline of the INFJ, I actually mean something more like a decline of the INFJ's status across historical time. Not necessarily something that is inevitable, or rather not necessarily something that is unchangeable. I'm particularly interested here in this idea of history. When we think of people in terms of types, we are all too easily tempted to conceive of these categories as coinciding with unchanging characteristics and perhaps properties and statuses. The historical avenue that is opened up by the Jungian conception of types tends to be somewhat left in the background. And that is something that I would like to change, partly through the various discussions in my channel and through this specific video today, and that I'd like to explore more in detail in the future as well. Because once you accept that there are psychological types, you kind of have to accept, and this is something that any thoroughgoing typology admits, arrives at, so to speak, from Jung to cognitive typing in terms of voltology or visual cues, similarly articulates a correspondence between having a certain type and having a certain kind of predisposition to a worldview. Cognitive typology calls it an ontological bias. Jung tends to prefer to refer to it as a theory of truth dependent upon a particular attitude to the world. So the implications of this from our contemporary modern viewpoints, especially the modern and contemporary scientific viewpoint, is something that is kind of anathema to it in a lot of ways, because it seems to reek of relativism. The idea that the determination of truth is ultimately dependent on a psychological disposition. Psychologism is something that is repellent to a lot of scientific viewpoints, as well as the more sort of analytical side of the philosophical world, the Anglophone side. So I don't know exactly that I would want to say, or that we would want to say, that truth is relative to a psychological point of view, but I think that cannot be applied wholesale. Certainly the fact that I am, to paraphrase someone speaking on Discord, whose example I thought was quite interesting or telling, I don't think that the truth of me being closer to my laptop at the moment than I am to the North Pole is relative to a psychological scheme. So it doesn't seem like it's something that can be applied wholesale. However, when it comes to the appreciation of certain metaphysical phenomena, it does seem like a particular psychological disposition is going to regulate the framework of rules and truths that can be determined. And the reason why I'm saying this is that the decline of the INFJ in historical time, I think, can be interpreted through this lens, whereby, and it's something that I touched on a little bit in relatively recent videos, but only as an aside, where I was talking about how in former times, the appreciation of archetypal contents in the unconscious and their concretization in the everyday life of people, so in former times, in so-called primitive times, the relationship between the everyday and the supernatural or the magical was experienced as something concrete, something. The magical aspect of it was something that's taken for granted completely, So Jung has an interesting example where he says, if, say, a relative was buried somewhere, and upon visiting it, the primitive, again, I'm using really inverted commas here, visited the site of that person's, where that person was buried, they saw a snake. For them, the idea that that was the soul of the departed, it was neither nonsensical, as the contemporary mind would take it, nor would it be symbolic, as perhaps a pre-modern mind would take it. It was real, concrete. That was the actual soul. It's very hard for us to understand, to appreciate that could have been the episteme, as Michel Foucault would call it, of people at the time. Furthermore, when, in the classical period, Plato talked about the ideal forms as containing reality within themselves, there's a very close connection to the archetypal concept. And the power of the symbol in medieval, pre-modern, and Renaissance times also speaks to the relationship to the archetypal symbol, the archetype in the unconscious. So what I mean is that the relation to symbolism and the suggestive power of the symbol in relation to reality is something that used to be a lot more powerful. Nowadays, we think much more in terms of the scientific viewpoints of, there are facts, there are laws. Symbols are just a manner of speaking. And if we can get rid of them, if we can get rid of allegory, if we can get rid of metaphor, so much the better. We want to be hard-nosed. We want to be, we want the truth of the fact. We don't care about your feelings. We don't care about intuitions. We don't care about metaphor. What are the facts telling us? When Bertrand Russell himself, and God knows how much I like Bertrand Russell, when he was asked on television, he was already in old age, what messages would you like to send to young generations before you passed? That was implied. One thing that he said at the moral level, love is wise, hatred is foolish. I completely agree. I think all of us will. But at an intellectual level, he says, when you're faced with an intellectual situations, ask yourself only what are the facts. Right? Ask yourself only what are the facts. On the one hand, I want to say that's good advice. But on the other hand, I want to say this is also representative of the devaluation of the symbol, the metaphor and allegory, and the appreciation of the truth of the world, of what goes beyond just the facts, Because it could also be argued that in our contemporary society, there is a neurosis that is going on. People are suffering from a loss of meaning. And the Daniel Dennett's of this world, the people who are, scientific realists and physicalists almost in the closest sense, or functionalists in the closest sense. Richard Dawkins is another example. I mean, they seem happy with this state of affairs, but there's not many of them that are happy. And we're not happy. We're looking for meaning somewhere. And to just be told that it's just a creation of the human mind is something that does not satisfy us. So some of us return to religion, or re-embrace religion. Some of us very much remain within religion. Others of us explore young or, forms of traditionalism or whatever it might be. We have our different ways of reconnecting because, this pure, austere, arid scientific viewpoint is not enough for most of us. So again, it's tempting to think that maybe those whom it suits, Daniel Dennett's and the Richard Dawkins, maybe it suits them because that's their psychological disposition to begin with. But also, what does that mean? Is that maybe this is an age for them. This is not an age for us. And that brings us back to this idea of decline. Because in primitive times, in classical times, in antiquity, in medieval times, and up until the Renaissance, it could be argued that this valuation of the symbol in the regime of truth that was already still considered legitimate was consonant with how the INFJ via NI, via FE, particularly via NI and FE, articulated a vision of the world that was very attuned with the unconscious and therefore attuned to whatever cannot be represented as a fact, because a fact presupposes, I spoke about this in my previous video, determinate content, that sharp limits, so that it can be designated as a fact. That is a product of consciousness, not of the unconscious. If an eye is attuned to the products of the unconscious, it's going to be fuzzier, it's going to be hazier, it's going to be more symbolic, it's going to be inimical to the Daniel Dennett's and the Richard Dawkins of this world, in some sense. So, in other words, we don't live in a society that has a valuation for these facts, I should not say facts in this case, for these modes of being and modes of knowing that are the natural go-tos for the INFJ. But it wasn't always the case. Like I said, in a society where the valuation of these aspects was strong, you couldn't really imagine that someone who was attuned to these contents was considered either an oracle, a prophet, but in the more everyday sense of the everyday INFJ person, a wise person, someone who had something to say, someone who had profound insights to share, who were considered socially, societally valuable in and of themselves. Not someone who was speaking nonsense or trying to harrow back to a time immemorial that no longer exists. That's why I think that you can really consider the status of the INFJ, not just now or from an eternal perspective, but really historically. Because there's always been INFJs, there's always been people of the 16 types. But historically, certainly, the status of each must have evolved, must have changed. The status of an INTP must have been different back then. The status of an INTJ or an ISTJ must have been different back then. The status of a high T person must have been different, or a high F person. Of course, it depends not just on historical time, but spatial geographies, cultures, religions, civilizations. But certainly when it comes to the history of the West, because this is my history in some sense, this is where I come from, it's very hard to deny that having an INFJ predisposition in terms of psychological makeup is accompanied by a to and froing in terms of how the INFJ is going to be perceived as fitting within society. And I think that nowadays, with the predominance of the scientific worldview, at the expense perhaps of other worldviews, the INFJ is condemned to either adapt and be unhappy and completely submitting, because it's a form of submission. You adapt to something that is not naturally your go-to, or accepting to live as a kind of psychological outsider, which the kind of sense of isolation that is required. So you need to have a really thick skin to be able to deal with that. Or the sort of crafty, intelligent, and kind of flexible INFJ who manages to find a philosophical system that somehow makes room for lots of different viewpoints. So it doesn't have to be relativism. It can be a form of neo-pragmatism. It can be a form of Wittgensteinianism. I know some INFJs who embrace the concept of language games as making room for those different viewpoints. But my contention is that all these are compromises in a world that fundamentally is asking us to either submit or to compromise, but never to be fully ourselves. So I'd like to know what you think, guys, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. And enjoy the rest of your day, and I will talk to you next week. see you then. And don't forget, you can support me on Patreon. Always very much appreciate the support of my patrons. Bye-bye.